California, where I do Indian astrology. But before I became a professional certified Indian astrologer, I was a very enthusiastic hobbyist of Western astrology, and had also studied traditional astrology with Bob Zoller. Had I maybe met him a little bit earlier, interesting moment. Well, let's just say I fell in love with Indian astrology, but I'm bilingual astrologically, and my master's degree is in the history of astrology, and that is the genesis really of this talk, because one of the papers I had to do was on house systems. Okay, so condos in America are what you would call something, I forgot the name now, but it's when you just own space, you don't actually own land. And you don't actually have to love math, that's a joke, because we're not going to do any math. But the first thing we have to do is okay, so as you all know, or should know, astrology, as we practice it, originated in a geocentric view. In other words, we thought the Earth was the center of the universe and everything was revolving around us. Not too different than the way we live our lives today, many of us. But here's the Earth in the middle, and it was believed that there were these concentric spheres, and Aristotle on down, they do different things to get the math to work, but we were kind of at the center and things were revolving around us. That's what it looks like. You just look outside, right? But that messes you up. No, actually, you love this. You want to stay with this. Oh, okay, one geocentric. All right, I just confused by the order. So there's so just keep that in your mind throughout the talk, and I'm going to come back and emphasize that point one more time. So there's basically 3 essentials in understanding this stuff. Let's see, I think I'm going to use this. So, if you're a Western astrologer, you're used to the pie slice chart, right? Like 12 slices in the pie. And when you're looking at a chart, right, the sun, here's the first house where my hand is, and 12 noon is now where my hand is. And so, during the course of the day, the signs are moving clockwise around our chart, right? That's called the diurnal. Diurnal just simply means day movement, and it goes clockwise. When I was first learning Western astrology, like how to calculate charts by hand, my first teacher, I was all excited. I brought in the homework, and she says, now, what time was the person born? And I said, 11:55 a.m. She said, okay, well, why is the sun in the 4th house? Oops, so again, you kind of, back in the days when you had to hand calculate, you would kind of see where the sun wound up, and if it wasn't in the region that it should be, your math was off, you reversed something like I did. That's diurnal movement, so that's clockwise movement. But the planets are moving in the counterclockwise, because Aries rises, then Taurus, then Gemini, so the planets are moving this way. If we just hold still and don't pay attention to the diurnal movement, the planets are moving counterclockwise, right? They're going from Aries all the way around. Basic principle. Now the houses themselves are fixed insofar as, does anyone know what direction east is?
Yeah.
Actually, I do have a compass, but we'll just say it's
there.
There.
Yeah. No, there.
There.
That way.
Okay, so let's say this is east, and I'll just put an E on the board. For the purposes of this class, we'll make this due east. So the houses, this is always going to be the first house. That doesn't move. And the 4th house is going to be down there, and the 10th house is going to be up there. And what house is over here?
7.
Right, 7. Those don't move. That's like the one fixed thing. No matter where you go, no matter what you do, the first house is always in that direction. Now, there's going to be a quiz. And I was trying to find a prize in the bookstore, but someone suggested, why don't you give away your time? So by the end of this lecture, I'm going to ask if you can identify, Rob, I think I may have to excuse you from the contest. But, there's one common element I will say underlies all the house systems. And if you can figure out what it is, and no one has, people come up with good answers, but the answer I'm looking for I haven't seen yet making this lecture. And whoever does will get 30 minutes of my time for whatever astrological purpose they want. So, so be thinking about that. Okay, what's underlying all these houses? Okay. So the ecliptic is the apparent path of the sun revolving around the earth. Right? Oh, you're joining the competition? Yeah, no, no, this zone of the room cannot be in the contest. All right. So the ecliptic, now you can say the ecliptic is the path of the earth around the sun. That would be like the more accurate way, but I told you not to think that way. We're always going to think geocentric when we're trying to conceptualize these house systems. So for us, we're going to say that the ecliptic is the sun's apparent path around the earth. Marks the ecliptic. And then we know where, and the first day of spring is the first beginning of Aries in Western astrology, tropical zodiac. And so we mark the positions of all the planets based on where they fall on the ecliptic, right? So if I'm the Earth, the ecliptic's not like this, it's like tilted up. That's why like we see the sun going up. It doesn't get quite right over our head, but it goes up, and that's we're seeing the arc of the ecliptic. I don't think we need to look at that just yet. Okay, so at the dawn of horoscopic astrology, that is the beginning of casting a chart for the moment someone was born. Two of the earliest surviving writers we have are Valens and Ptolemy, and they teach something called whole sign houses. And this is very easy. You just see what degree is rising on the eastern horizon. Let's just pretend this is Aries. And if the middle of Aries is there, that'd be 15 degrees Aries. So whole sign houses say all of Aries becomes the first house. And you're done. Taurus is the second, Pisces is the 12th house. Now maybe that's a little too simple since Aries is the first sign of the zodiac. So let's say Cancer is rising. 15 degrees, let's say 29 degrees of Cancer is rising. According to whole sign houses, all, whether it's 1 degree or 29 degrees, all of Cancer becomes the first house.
That's about the biggest brain strain that people encounter when that happens.
Yeah. So I've had a lot of people who thought of themselves as bashful, 12th house people that suddenly become, brazen first house when they do whole sign houses. So don't, and I'm not going to advocate that everyone switch to whole sign houses, but I will say that the dawn of our tradition and pretty much everything, most of what we hold dear, arises out of astrologers doing charts using whole sign houses. Now, how do we get all the million different house systems? We will come to that in due time. So that's it. Sign equals house. Very easy. No math involved. As long as you can calculate the ascendant, you're really done.
With the time of birth, where do you then put that ascendant? Yeah.
For the place. You calculate it based on the place.
No. So if the whole house is the first house, where's the ascendant?
Great question. So, you still mark the ascendant where it is.
Where it is.
Yes,
Okay.
you want to pay attention to that.
So
That's a sensitive point for sure.
Okay, so it stays in 15.
Yeah, you don't leave it blank. You would still put ascendant, 29 degrees Scorpio, and you would just put it, at the end. But the whole sign would be
Considered the first
considered the first house.
house. Yeah.
Anyone have any questions about the whole sign houses? Easy peasy. Astrology doesn't get any easier than that.
You're of course skipping over the other great embarrassment.
Yeah,
White
well,
House
this,
midheaven.
it's an hour and a half, or hour, 15 minutes lecture, so, yeah. As a teacher, I had a teacher once that said, a little misinformation saves a lot of explanation. So I'm not going to deliberately give you misinformation, but I guess some of these concepts are, I'm not a spherical astronomical guy, but I've done my best to, represent these concepts. But to some extent, some things will be a bit oversimplified, but hopefully not so much that it's blatantly false. But yeah, little misinformation. So if I was giving this lecture in the year 200, we'd be done. Because there were no house systems. Everyone did whole sign houses. And you'd all know how to do it now. Because in the morning we would have had a class on how to calculate the ascendant. And then you'd be done. But sadly, or for good, time went on. Now, between 71 BCE, which simply means, before our common era, before Christ was born, up to about 621, CE is just the scholarly way of saying AD. We have 168 charts that have survived intact. Okay, so that's, 700 years and 168 charts have survived. Now, does that mean, geez, astrologers must have been starving for business? No. It just meant that those are the only ones that have survived in either writings or whatnot. Only 27 of those mention the midheaven. Notice how in whole sign houses, there was no mention of a midheaven. And that's because only 16% of these charts actually mentioned it. Of those, only 2 out of the 27 mention different house cusps. Yes?
And they're used only to determine the strength of the planet.
Which I will get to. Please, Rob. If I say something that's patently wrong, please jump in immediately.
Open a mouth, insert my foot. Okay.
Okay. One of those 2, so now we have one chart out of 168, uses porphyry, what can be identified as a porphyry house system, which I'll explain shortly. And that one's dated fairly late. And the other one, according to the scholars that look at this, they can't really figure out, but it just may be bad math. Not every astrologer is good at this stuff. And the other one might actually be trying to be porphyry or, whatever. We're just not sure. It just looks like maybe the math is off, they say. 4 charts out of 168 use equal houses without a midheaven. Now, what's equal houses? That's really easy. 29 degrees Scorpio, every 29 degrees marks the next house. So again, you're done. And it's fairly early in the time stream. Those charts are from the year 15, 46, 71, and 81. Kind of interesting. We'll come back to equal houses, I hope. Okay, so we think that around this date, although maybe this has changed with more recent scholarship, but that's when we started being able to calculate an ascendant. And that's the dawn of probably the whole sign house system. Porphyry system, I'm going to save because I actually have, I guess I do. Okay, so Valens is one of the few Hellenistic writers whose writings have survived. And what's really cool about his writings is he wrote a lot. And he says that he traveled all around the world trying to learn astrological secrets, and he had clients, and he has example charts in his writing, and he's really a journeyman astrologer. I mean, he's really like working the astrology. You can see that in his writings. And luckily, we have what appears to be his, entire corpus, which he was writing to his son as an instructor, or his favorite student, or something like that. And he was writing somewhere around this time period, 150, 175-ish, but his writings have survived and have relatively recently been translated into English if you're interested in that stuff. And he mentions the porphyry system, which is a way of divvying up the houses, I'll explain in a minute. It's also fairly simple. But he used it only to determine planetary strength. In other words, angular houses, planets are stronger than succeeding houses that are stronger than Caton houses. But that determination, you would use the porphyry house system. So you could have, in whole sign houses, a planet in the first house that wasn't as strong as a normal first house planet because in porphyry, it got thrown into the second. But whenever you would talk about topics in the life, you'd go back to whole sign. That's the original kind of conceptual split in terms of coming up with complicated house systems. Now, we'll learn that almost every house system is not named for the person who invented it, but for the person who popularized it. So Valens tells us that a guy named Orion, whose writings don't survive, invented this, what we now call porphyry house system. Now, why is this little fact in there? Well, MA in astrology, so you get some history. Okay, what is the meridian exactly? Okay, so we're talking about, in other words, to calculate porphyry, you need to know what the MC is. And the MC is determined by the meridian. Now, the meridian is, I think I have a slide coming up on this, but straight overhead is what they call the zenith point. The zenith, right? And at some point, the sun, around noonish, will get as high in the sky as it can. So we imagine that there's a circle, a giant circle going around the Earth that goes through the point where the sun reaches its highest point and the zenith of where I am locally. And wherever that is, that's how we get the MC. So if I'm the Earth, let's see if I can do this right. If I'm the Earth, and this is, I mean, this would be going, you imagine that this is a more giant version, but, it's going through the zenith, and assuming the highest point of the sun happened to be right there, and wherever that was on the zodiac, on the ecliptic, that marks the MC. The IC is just the opposite place down below. And to get the porphyry houses, you simply take the distance from that to the ascendant, and you just equally divide it into 3 zones. And then you take the rest of the thing and divide that equally by 3 zones, and then you repeat on the other side of the chart. Does everyone understand that, or does anyone not understand that?
No,
It's very easy.
but that's exactly the same as equal house.
No. No, equal house doesn't take into account the MC.
Oh,
So
yes.
porphyry, we're dividing that space equaling to thirds. Equal is just dividing the whole ecliptic or zodiac into equal things. Okay, so that's
Both parts, if you want to turn for generic 30-degree chunks.
now. I sort of said this at the beginning. Here is the way we sort of think of the world. The sun's in the middle, and everything's revolving around it. And we are ingrained with this from a very early age. It's called heliocentrism. Helios, sun, everything revolves around the sun. And this is, in fact, unless there's a huge conspiracy like the flat earth people argue, this is, quote, objective reality is the fact that, this is what's going on. But like I said, if you try to keep this in your mind when you're working out these house systems, it will just mess up your understanding. So just keep the Earth in the center. Be like me, just say the apparent path of the sun. Yeah, it's not the actual path around the sun. We know the Earth is doing the movement, but it looks like it's the sun doing it, and that'll keep everything a lot easier when we go through these houses. There's another picture of the beautiful geocentric model. Okay, geocentric with no mix-ups. I said this yesterday, but in case no one knows how big a degree is in the sky, and this is just fun to know. Yes?
2 fingers.
2 fingers is 1 degree. Or a full moon is half a degree. So 2 full moons are, but usually if you hold, unless you have very small dainty hands, you will, the moon will be about a finger's width, but it's about a moon. It's a half a degree. So 2 moons, 2 full moons is a degree. Okay. So I've already introduced the zenith. There's a little guy, Genesis me. Straight up is the zenith. The horizon, which I'm not going to really talk about too until we get to some of the later house systems. The horizon is the line that marks our horizon. But most house systems sort of configure everything from where you were born, but as if lines were going to the center of the earth. But the horizon is something, because we will see something rising above the horizon when something goes up. Here's the meridian. So the meridian is literally, it's this circle. So it's going through, let's assume, actually that's just showing the pole star. Let's just pretend that's the sun. And let's pretend that's the highest point of the day. So again, the circle that crosses the zenith and the meridian. In case you're a learner that learns better for two-dimensional things instead of me, here's a little picture that just illustrates what I showed you before. Okay, now, I think we need to go over that one. Okay. This I got from an astronomy book, not an astrology book, which is why I was talking about stars rising. But basically, let's say this is the ecliptic. It's not exactly at right angles from our horizon. That's why the sun is not, unless you're right at the equator, it's never right overhead. It's, up in the sky. The further north latitude you get, the less height the sun actually reaches in the sky. Celestial Equator. Okay, so, and I mentioned this yesterday. So the other circle, so now you have the apparent path of the sun, which we call the zodiac or the ecliptic. I'm just going to kind of use those words interchangeably. And that's, got kind of an angle around where we are right now. The celestial equator is just like take the Earth's equator and, oh, who had the orange? Yes. Thank you very much. But you got good remedial. Whoever filled it for me got good remedial. Yes, thank you.
It's a lovely frame.
So let's say this is the Earth. And, your standard picture of the Earth, will show it like, oh, the country's falling off here. All right.
Which one do you want to get rid of?
South Africa.
Someone just told me, Heathrow's on high alert now, so I don't know, but I've been disconnected from the news the last few days. But in any event, let's just say the Earth is still intact. And it's, the way it's commonly drawn, North Pole would be up here, and the equator's the fat section in the middle, right? It's the line that goes around the middle. And we just project that out into space, and that becomes the, that becomes the celestial equator, which is going to come into play for there we go. Okay. So the equator is simply that line projected out. Now, unfortunately, we're not standing on the North Pole. So again, as we tilt the Earth to where we are, it's at another angle. So the ecliptic is like this. The equator is going to be at another angle. I erased it, but I drew this yesterday where we have the ecliptic going this way, the equator going that way. I mean, it will vary depending on your latitude, the relationship between the two, but they're not the same. But it's another great circle that we can project onto the sky. We'll come back to this. All right, so I don't think we need the slide anymore, but this is the sun appearing to go around the Earth, and this is the band of the zodiac, with the sun marking the middle of it. Zenith is what lies above, horizon. We already went through this. I just taught you what the meridian was, and I just taught you what the celestial equator was. Oh, And right ascension, now for years as a amateur astrologer, I was very confused about right ascension. But all right ascension is how do you measure things along the celestial equator? We use longitude and latitude for the ecliptic. So we all know when we look at a chart, if your sun is at 12 degrees Capricorn, that means that it's in the sign of, the zone of the zodiac represented by Capricorn is at the 12th degree out of 30, and we know where it is on the circle. But with the equator, they don't number it like that. They actually use time. So right ascension is marked as time. And if so distance on the celestial equator is marked in right ascension, and north or south of that is, who remembers this from yesterday, declination. That's where declination comes from. Which is why you can have a planet with a north declination and a south. You can have a planet that's north of the ecliptic and south in declination because of the relationship of these two things. Now, let's say you're confused at this point. Don't worry. It's not essential to what's to come. I want to just told you what declination is. Okay, that's good. So here we go. So here is, let's pretend the Earth is in the middle. We project, we're assuming that the cosmos is a giant sphere around us. This green line is the celestial equator, and how we measure things along that is by right ascension. The ecliptic is like this at kind of an angle, and that's another visual thing. And this declination would be north of this line. If something fell below that, it would be south. I think that's all we need for that. First of all, when does this end? We go to
Hours
4.
to go.
We can go to 4.
Hours to go.
No, that's good. But
We're away.
I'm just trying to case it. So the ecliptic is inclined to the equator by about 23 and some change, and then depending on the definition you're going to use for the zodiacal zone, the ecliptic might be 18 degrees wide. Again, depending on if you want to make sure Pluto stays in there, you could use 18 degrees wide. Celestial longitude is how we measure planets. When we print out a chart and it says something is in 5 degrees, Gemini, 21 minutes, that's celestial longitude. We just drop that off and call it longitude in the chart. Just like we don't use celestial latitude when we're looking at planets. So the ascendant is where the ecliptic and the horizon meet. And it moves around. If you can, if you have a view that's flat, which probably doesn't happen here, but certainly you notice that the sun sets in a different place as you go through the seasons. So it's also rising in a different place if you get up early and you're not fogged in. And it moves around. And the midheaven is, I left this kind of out. So the midheaven is, we have the circle that's going through the zenith, what's right above me, and the highest point that the zodiac reaches, the sun would mark on that day. And we go down to where on the ecliptic that degree falls. That's where we get that number from, of the MC. Where does it fall on the ecliptic? This will be my ecliptic one. No, actually. Yes, this was going to be my Earth, and this was going to be my ecliptic. Okay.
Feels like you're about to start juggling.
Well, usually I have them slightly different sizes so they fit easier, but this one actually breaks apart, and I was able to bring it from America. So we're always measuring where things fall on the ecliptic, no matter where it's happening. The MC is happening way above. Well, actually, no, it's actually marking the ecliptic, wherever that degree is, and that's how we get the MC. So it's just basically that meridian great circle, when you were born, what degree marked that highest point in the sky, that's where we get the MC from. Conversely, on the other side is the IC. This is showing us the equator is this line that's just a line, and with all these little dots in it, that's the slice of the ecliptic, and that's just showing that there's an incline there. They're not, it'd be nice if, we were standing on the North Pole to make a lot of these explanations much easier, but we're not. And we'll find out that astrology, as we know it, kind of fails way up there, or way down below. Okay, so, I mentioned these guys before, Valens and Ptolemy. Basically, they use the whole sign houses, which we already learned, for topical inquiries. What do I mean by that? Topics in the life. They use whole sign. Porphyry, or something that involved an MC, was used as a strength calculation. By the way, this sort of survives in the Indian tradition, where we have always used whole sign houses, but we also, part of our strength calculation involves how angular things are.
Really, the first person has been able to give me a clue as to when you use which.
Yeah,
And that's what I was hoping it would be.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's buried in the strength calculations, but in there is this notion that it's something you would take into account as part of the Shambhala calculation. It forms a piece of it. Okay, now as we go further down the time stream, we see that as late as the 800s, at least one famous astrologer was using whole sign. I mean, whole sign seems to be what everyone was doing until math got more sophisticated. And what happens is, do I spell this out on the slide? Okay, so we get the actual Porphyry living in the 300s, and he uses the Orion house system, but because he's using it and becoming popular, we call it the Porphyry house system. Why did I call this Alexandrius? Did he use whole sign for Charles? Okay, that's why. So 4th century Paulus, this writing is available in English. Again, topics are done by whole sign. The early Arabic period, whole sign is used for natal and horary. And it's really the 8th and 9th centuries that you get quadrant systems, although there is an equal house that will appear a little earlier. But basically, it's the 8th and 9th centuries that we start getting quadrant systems. I mean, it's almost as if, as our math got more sophisticated, people were like, it can't be that easy. There's got to be more to it. And so they made astrology more complicated. Better? Maybe. Complicated isn't necessarily better, but I'm also not saying that it's not. So one of the problems that happens is as these texts are translated into different languages, the distinction between using a whole sign house for topics and using a quadrant system, which is any house system that's going to involve the MC and divide things up unequally. We're going to call it a quadrant system. All your house systems pretty much are quadrant systems, except maybe equal, because it does leave out the MC. That distinction gets lost in translation. And so the astrologers of the day think, we have to calculate the MC and figure out house cusps, and boy, that seems kind of weird. We just divide it by 3, and then they start looking in the sky and finding more complicated ways of doing things. But that's the beginning. I mean, had things been clearly translated, we'd all be using whole sign houses. There wouldn't be a house sign debate. I mean, there wouldn't be different, what house system do you use? Oh, the one my teacher taught me. And we all would have been taught whole sign, because that's what everyone was doing pretty much. But
I have a name. What house system you use? My teacher system.
yes. had the chalkboard been, actually I once did this lecture where I did a little contest where like, what are the most popular things, house systems, and of course the most popular punchline of the joke was what my teacher taught me. I mean, I didn't even know there were house systems until I was doing astrology for like 5 or 6 years. I mean, my teacher taught me classes. I thought, oh, this is just the way you do astrology. There weren't as many books, and we didn't have the internet back then. Okay, so there's two ways we can look at these different house systems. We can say that it's innovation and it's progress. In other words, yeah, the math was simple. Life is more complicated. We should have complicated house systems. But just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, or if it isn't broken, why fix it? So, you know, one argument for, I'm just seeing how much, okay, it is. Okay, I'm just trying to pace myself. So I'm not going to belabor this point because we're going to jump into different house systems now, but I'm just going to say you might want to just experiment with whole sign houses, since without that we wouldn't be probably doing Western astrology. And it's important to remember that they must have gotten pretty good results from it, because why would people keep doing astrology if it wasn't producing some good? So I'll just leave it to you. Rob has a beautiful thin book, if it's still available, on whole sign. You can get it from his website, and I used to give it away as gifts.
We download it from our website.
And it can be downloaded, so you can be reading it tonight. So and he'll give you the more astrological reasons and examples of how to think about it. You know, even if you're like married to doing your horary charts with Regiomontanus.
And it solves the midheaven.
And it's also the head problem. All right, equal houses is real easy. You just add 30 degrees to the ascendant. I kind of already covered this. So if your ascendant degree is, what's your favorite ascendant degree? Doesn't have to be your own.
14.
14 of?
Pisces.
14 Pisces. So the second house cusp would be 14 Aries, right? And then just all the way around. Now, most modern people would still throw the midheaven in there, and we'll cover that. Like, well, if you're using whole sign or equal houses, you just ignore the midheaven? Do you pay attention to it? What do you do with it? We'll cover that later. And a lot of people use this, and there's also this notion of the 5-degree rule. If something is like, you know, within 5 degrees of the, actually, let's not talk about that. It's not important to actually understanding the math of Firmicus Maternus talks about the equal house system fairly early, but he's also using whole signs. This Arab guy in 835 is using both. Jerome Cardan, we mentioned briefly yesterday, he liked the equal house system. Very few of his contemporaries were using it. They were using like Regio or Campanus, I think. We'll get to the slides of those in a couple of slides. But he used equal house, although in his writings, he says, you know, I think Alcavicius might be more appropriate for house placement, but his example charts are all equal, which is another weird thing in astrology. Sometimes you'll have an actual work will involve another house system. Then in modern times, Margaret Home, the modern textbook of astrology, which was written in the 50s, 1951, which is still a great book, but maybe I think that because it was one of the first books I read on astrology. She advocated, yeah,
Pretty good book.
yeah. She advocated equal houses. Don Jacobs, a famous American astrologer in the 60s. Nancy McCullough, who I believe recently passed away, was a Texas astrologer who years and years ago wrote a book. Is everyone familiar with the relationship book by Ronald Davison? So he uses Placidus there. And what she did in her little book, which was unequal versus equal, is she took all of his example charts in that book and showed how if you used equal, you got easier and clearer. The points he was trying to make in that relationship were better seen in the equal house. So it's one of the few times someone's actually printed a, let's look at different house systems. I'm actually working on an article where I'm taking some of Lily's horary and then looking at them Holstein and showing, you know, how it also works. Marie Mathias is a current living Western astrologer and also Kepler graduate, and she loves the equal house system. Okay, what do you do with the MC? We'll get to that later. Okay, Campanus. How many people use the Campanus house system? Anyone? 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 Okay, we'll go through it really fast. Al-Biruni is the first one that mentions it according to the literature we have, but he talks as if it's been, like everyone knew what it was. You know, it's not like introduced as a new thing, it's introduced as, oh yeah, I'm also doing this. You know, other people through the years did it, and finally, the Campanus brothers published a table of houses in 1468, and now we start the era of astrologers use whatever's easiest. Now, a table of houses has worked all the math out for you. So there's very little math you have to do to figure out. You just calculate the ascendant, know what your latitude is, go into the book and get all your house cusps. This is how I started doing astrology with the Placidus table of houses, but I don't even think the word Placidus was on there, because I just thought, oh, this is how you do astrology.
Dalton, right?
Yeah, yeah. Because these brothers published it, it became known as the Campanus system, but we actually don't know who invented it because it appears, you know, earlier. And how do you do it? The prime vertical is divided into 3 equal segments. Now, what is the prime vertical? The prime vertical, you know, horizontal, like, is this way, like a line down horizontally. So vertical is this way. We know, what I didn't mention was the meridian is running north-south, which actually I've been pointing it east. So we're going to have to pretend, so reframe all that discussion of the MC as, yes, but for purposes of illustration, it's going to be perpendicular. So I should have been holding the, you know, we'll pretend like the MC's up there. It's a north-south, the meridian runs north-south through the zenith and through the highest point in the sky. The prime vertical is the same kind of circle, but it's running east-west. So it's going through the ascendant, through the highest point, through the descendant. And so what you do is you take that, well, I really messed up by not doing this right the first time. Okay, well, hopefully you follow me. Maybe I just should have made this direction east-west, but oh well. So the horizon is here. It's going straight up. You know, the MC, you can face north-south. Well, actually, this is east, and that's going to be south, right? You take that space, you divide it equally into 3 parts, and then you draw arcs down to the ecliptic, and wherever that falls, that's what house system you get. And depending on what latitude you get these weird distortions, and they're not equal. They're not like porphyry, they're not equal, because you're actually using a circle that's running like this, and you're dividing it, okay, on different times of the year, the midheaven is going to be moving around, and so that space that you're dividing equal as you then draw arcs over. But really the takeaway is you're dividing what's called the prime vertical. It's just like the midheaven, but going east-west, and dividing that into 3 and projecting that. And it's the math that projects it that creates the unequal houses. Okay, I'm explaining what prime vertical is. Why do I keep doing that? Hold it. No, I just accidentally turned my computer off and I'm turning it back on. Okay, any questions so far?
So Campanus is doing the projection onto the ecliptic.
Yeah, everything is projecting on the ecliptic. That's where you're getting the longitude of the space. You know, so when you're looking at something and you've got 15 degrees of one sign marking the first house and 29 degrees of something else, if you were using Campanus, it's coming from the prime vertical. Okay. Oh, this is where the orange slice is coming. So, so you kind of can, if you've ever opened an orange before, and hopefully you have, that's how you can kind of visualize this. In that you've got the prime vertical here intersecting with the, you know, I think I explained it so we don't actually need this
Yeah.
thing. But what happens is that you've got these, in terms of visualizing how you're dividing things by third, you're taking the distance from that prime vertical and you're crossing over to the ecliptic. That's what this is showing, how you're getting your house systems, and they're turning out to be slightly unequal. We'll come back to this when we get to the Regio houses.
By the way, those wedges are called looms.
Wedges are called
Looms, L-U-D-N.
in an orange or in the sky?
In the sky.
I know that. All right. Well, who uses Regiomontanus? Okay, a couple people. Who uses Placidus?
I use
Who
both.
uses whole sign?
I use both.
Okay. Who uses like a weird house system that none of their friends use? Okay. No, because all right, sometimes I had a lady, what about topocentric, you know? Oh. So I made a slide for her, but okay, so Regiomontanus. This first appears in the late thousands. It gets, you know, these are Arabic writers writing about how to calculate this. The guy we call Regiomontanus did what? He printed a table of houses and everyone loved it. And it became super popular because astrologers are, in addition to being smart, lazy, right. Right. Efficient. Okay, efficient. So many people start doing, again, he printed the table of houses, it has his name, but again, we don't really know who the first person was. But this involves dividing the equator into 3 equal segments from the ascendant to the MC and projecting that onto the ecliptic. So I explained what the, so the prime vertical was going east-west, right? And the celestial equator is this way. So now what we're doing is we're finding where the ascendant, and if we were to draw a line from the meridian down, where does the MC fall in the equator? Let's divide this region into 3 equal places and project it back onto the ecliptic. And where does that fall? And again, the math of getting it from that one circle that's lying this way and this circle that's lying this way, you know, it doesn't end up being equal. You know, so it comes out as unequal on a printout. And that's what these illustrations are showing. But I'm going to kind of breeze through it because was that kind of clear? In other words, you're just using the circle it's based on. So, in other words, this is what's happening, right? I mean, we're not inside the minds of the astrologers that did it, but someone was using the prime vertical because they thought, I think that's a significant circle that has meaning, and I should integrate it into the horoscope, and was like, well, geez, we're going to pay attention to that circle. Seems like the Earth's equator would be more important, and so the Regiomontanus, you know, house system is born. I mean, all of these are born from someone thinking that some circle somewhere was important and should be tied into the birth chart. Does anyone here do Koch?
I used to.
Yes, I know you used to. All right. So, divide equally the circle parallel to the equator found at the ascendant to MC. Project results to ecliptic by circles parallel to the horizon. Okay, so if I've written this right, we're going to, here's the equator. Now we're standing somewhere weird on Earth, but we're going to draw lines parallel to the equator until it reaches the horizon. Now it's not going to match the horizon because the horizon's probably not parallel to the equator. But I mean, if we were standing on the North Pole, yes, but we're not. So it's going to be at some weird little angle. And then we're going to, okay, circle, divide equally the circle parallel to the equator, found at the ascendant to the MC, and project the results on the ecliptic. I have to say I'm now confused because I haven't thought about this in a while. Oh, okay, I gotcha. So we've got the ascendant point, and the midheaven is somewhere higher, so we need like more circles to get us up there, right? But we're going to divide that space, as it were, into 3, and where those points of the circle intersect, we're going to project onto the ecliptic, which is this line, and get our uneven, what will turn out to be uneven houses most of the time. Now, he liked this because it had some connection to the horizon. So he thought this was, more accurate, right? I mean, that was kind of the basis of his thinking as far as I can tell. And it was popular amongst astrologers once upon a time. Prime vertical, let's just get that each time. I don't need to know that. Regiomontanus. I already explained to you, so that was, I'm going backwards, that's why. Okay. Alcavicius. First time I gave this lecture, I totally choked on this one, so let's see how I do this time. This is probably like the 4th or 5th time I've done this, so, this lecture. Rhetorius first uses the math that we now call the Alcavicius system in 500, and then Alcavicius uses it in 967, and for some reason his name gets attached to it. We don't call it the Rhetorius method. And by the way, again, it was probably before Rhetorius, because no one is really claiming to be the one that invented this. They've all learned it from someone else that we don't know necessarily, except in the case of Orion. And this becomes popular in the Middle Ages, and people that are like hardcore medieval style astrologers will use Alcavicius to this day, including Bob Zoller. Like, you took his course, you learned Alcavicius.
I can tell you why Alcavicius became dominant in Europe.
Yes.
And why it was given to his name. His introduction, or Isabella, as we call him Latin, became the standard textbook in the universities of Europe for teaching astrology. And since that's the way he did the houses, the rest is...
All right, so for the tape, if his voice didn't pick up, Alcavicius wrote the textbook that became like the dominant text in the university system. Now, a bunch of light bulbs should be going on. They taught astrology in medieval universities, but yeah, it's a different world.
In the medical faculty.
In the medical faculty, right, because you were allowed to do that. Weather, medical, stuff involving the body. The church just wanted you out of the soul.
Yeah.
But other things are okay. So because that was the textbook everyone was using, the way just like my teacher taught me a way to do it, and I didn't know there was any other way, Alcavicius becomes kind of the dominant system. Now, the definition of this is you take the diurnal circle through the ascendant onto the ecliptic by means of hour circles. So,
It's time related.
Right ascension between the ascendant.
Strongly recommend you burn your copy of Lawrence.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in that case,
Let's read.
However, that one's correct.
okay.
I have good news for you.
All right, okay, good. So hour circles are circles that pass through the pole. The meridian is an hour circle, like we talked about. Now we're reordering the meridian this way. We're taking MCs that way. The end is ahead, north-south circle. That's an hour circle, and any other circle you want to create. So in other words, now we're holding the orange this way, and we're creating slices of space, but it's based on time. So we're looking at the time it takes on the day you were born, for the ascendant to get to the midheaven, and then we're creating circles of time. So, where was that point in an hour? Where was it? We divide that time. We create these hour circles. I'm definitely oversimplifying this because when we look at the picture, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. Here's the ecliptic. We're looking at, okay, let's monitor the space between when that point rises and when it gets to the midheaven. And using these hour circles, we're going to find out where in the middle of that time the circle was, and then we're going to draw a line down to the ecliptic, because we always go down to the ecliptic. By the way, that's not the answer to the quiz. And that's where we get the house cusps. So it's the first that we know of that was thinking of just of passage of time, not just space. A lot of these are find 2 points in space, divide them 3, go down to the whatever. Now we're getting into, let's take time into consideration. How long does it take for something to get from point A to point B? That is the ascendant to the midheaven, and then create our pie slices that way.
Does that make equal house?
No, because because of the distortion between these circles and the ecliptic, it ends up being uneven. And again, the further up in latitude you go, like I'm not exactly sure, we're relatively close to the equator, so people born and raised in South Africa, they can probably go through 10 house systems and not make a lot of changes. But people in North America, Europe, the further north you go in latitude or south, the more dramatic these shifts are, because the relationship of the circles is different, more extreme, and so that you get these weird little squished houses in some cases. Okay, everyone's favorite, Placidus. Abraham ibn Ezra uses this. Here's another guy, an Italian, who used Regio, but taught Placidus. Now why, I don't know, but you find this among astrologers that sometimes use a house system, but for some reason think another thing is better. Maybe because the math was tough, but it was this guy Placidus that in the 1600s that popularized it, and it's similar to Alphabetius in that we're looking at a passage of time, but we're not paying attention to hour circles anymore. We're just looking at the time a degree moves from the ascendant to the midheaven. You trisect that time and project that down to figure out the degrees. Now, what I said sounds so simple. You're like, well, no wonder everyone did this. But the math is insane to get this right. And Rob was just telling me how insane it is. That the computers have to calculate an approximation, and then approximation, and modify that to finally get to what it is. No one would be using this at all, I think, if it weren't for table of houses. Because the trig, it's not even trig, what do we call that math? It's difficult. It's difficult math, even to the day of computers.
Oh yes. You've heard of cubic equations, quadratic equations.
Yes.
This can best be described as n undefined equations.
Yeah.
The number of dimensions is so.
My math skills are so poor, I can't imagine why it would be so complicated. But just take the time from, here's your ascendant, here's your midheaven, the time it takes that point to get there, trisect the time. It seems like it would be easy, but it isn't for some reason. And I'm sure if there was a mathematician in the audience, they could explain it. But it's the important point is you are taking time. So modern apologists of this method will say, well, we're incorporating time into the birth chart, the time it takes a point to get from here to there. Okay. This was my first astrology teacher. Oh, yeah, so this is a tribute to my first astrology teacher, Helena Runau, who taught me Placidus house system, but she didn't teach it as that, she just taught it as this is how you do astrology. But she has nothing to do with how popular it is. It was really this guy, R.C. Smith, we know him as Raphael, in 1821, published a table of houses, which was reprinted and republished and redone. And when other people did Table of Houses, they did Placidus. Eventually, that name was even dropped from the Table of Houses. The first one I had, I think the Rosicrucian Fellowship's Table of Houses is this. So, I mean, it's just all, this is what a lot of 20th century astrologers were using, especially in the days before computers, because there was a Table of Houses. You didn't have to do any math. Well, the only math you had to do was addition and subtraction to figure it out. If astrology, blah, 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 I'm a Leo. No one here does this. So, now, did I leave anyone's favorite house system out? Yes.
With archivicious houses, so Ficino was quite fond of using Regiomontanus because there were tables around. Some of his charts on that. But he preferred for his own chart archivicious houses. And I can't decide whether he did it because he preferred the placement of Saturn in the ninth of that particular chart for himself.
Yes.
Or whether he saw those concentric circles going from the equator and ascending, and whether that was part of his religious underpinning for the choice of.
That is a really great question, and really it could go either way. And maybe it was both. Maybe one got him thinking about it, and he was like, hell, my sound is a lot better than this. Sold. But no, there's no, I haven't seen anything that points why. As with many questions in astrology, yes.
In the really obscure department, there is a house system that was advocated by the late Edward Lindo in the first half of the 20th century called the Marinus house system.
Right,
Marinus proposed it, described it, but never used it.
right, right.
And Lindo decided it was the cat's meow.
Yeah. Marinus was kind of a lily-like figure who unfortunately chose to write in Latin instead of his native Italian? No, French. Excuse me, French. Jet lag. He also wrote a huge corpus, which is now available in English, chock full of very interesting stuff. He has quote a house system that he never used. And as far as I know, no one's used it, which is based on using the MC and kind of creating equal houses from that. Okay, so what is the common denominator underlying all house systems, and by all I mean mostly all?
One, I think. There's only one common denominator.
Is there?
And they're all divided into 12. And they all follow the same sequence. Like in meaning, and they all
Okay,
go
that's
into
good. You're getting in the
clockwise.
ballpark. It's not quite the keyword I'm looking for. Yes.
360 degrees?
Good, good, but no. Yes.
They're all mathematically good.
Too general, but good. That's good. We're listening. Yes, but that is not what I'm looking for. Principle. There's a principle. There's kind of a principle behind all of them.
Fixed.
Fixed? No,
They
that's
relate to
good.
the diurnal.
Okay, those are all good answers.
Circles.
Clockwise.
Geometry.
It's a clockwise motion that you're trying to.
You're almost making it too complicated.
Northern and southern.
Or I'm a terrible teacher.
No.
Going once,
Common denominator.
going twice.
You want to give it?
The units only give us 30 minutes to anyone.
Right.
This is racing ahead.
Well, the planets.
They're all dividing some circle equally. All of these are dividing some circle equally. So whole sign houses divides the zodiac, just takes the equal division of the zodiac at 30 degrees, finds the ascendant point, and creates your whole sign. Everyone else never abandoned that principle of somehow dividing something equally. It's something into equal thirds. And that principle of equalness underlies every
Yeah.
single.
No, there is one howling exception. Placidus has no circle divided into 12 parts.
Except he's dividing the concept of time into three equal.
But they're triple
You're right, it's
divisions
not,
of unequal quadrants.
yes, but it's still, the concept is,
That's
Take that
actually the main
time.
criticism offered by mathematical types against it. You're dividing unequal
this is what I
quadrants.
said
equally.
mostly off. This is what I said mostly off. Although I didn't, I'm curious the answer
It's a
to
big
that.
book. Yeah.
I'm just, but, this note, and this is what I want you to get really. This concept of let's take something and divide it equally is profoundly underlying a lot of the thinking. It's just like people pick different circles.
Yeah.
So my advice to you is to stick with your favorite house system, or try try whole sign houses. So just to review, whole sign was introduced at the dawn of horoscopic astrology. Porphyry is mentioned as to be used to evaluate planetary strength. Now what you might want to do is use your favorite house system as a planetary strength indicator, and then go back to analyzing topics by whole sign. Just see what happens, people. Just see. Oh, what about the MC? Yeah, we have a few minutes. So, you can still, so people that use either equal houses or whole sign houses, they'll still make use of the MC. So this astrologer says that the MC, these are just a couple of different opinions. It shows you how you express your ambition, and planets gain strength, and it indicates career interests. So if it falls in the 11th house or the 9th house, like it might, depending on where you are, again, down here probably never happens, but if you're clients that are born at a different latitude, that would be one way to approach the MC. Bob Zoller uses both as significators for career, and I'm not sure what book I got Rob Hands, but
That's the whole sign houses.
that's a whole sign houses. It's an important point, and it indicates one's actions as a whole, which might be slightly different than specific career indicators. So these are some ideas, and I actually, I hate to say it, I forgot what my idea was. I mean, it's a significant experience when the sun hits noon. So I think it is important to note the MC, and I think that planets probably gain a kind of strength by being close to that point, even if it is in the 9th house, quote unquote, a Caton house, or 11th house. It is reaching its quote highest point that it can in the sky. So I think that, and that's just a modification, a combination of all these different ideas. But just here are different. So it's like you don't have to get rid of it, although some people do, and there still are great astrologers. But you can try a whole sign or equal and still keep your MC. Just in the 2 or 3 minutes we have remaining, what do they do in India? It's whole sign, because Indian astrology and Western astrology are siblings, I would argue, from the same parent, and they use whole sign. So the earliest writings we have surviving this that clearly state whole sign is Varmahira, and he's quoting a bunch of other ancient authors, so that's just how everyone started to do horoscopic astrology. And to this day, most Indians, practitioners of Indian astrology, just use whole sign houses and get great results from that. There's something called Tripadi house system that was introduced in 1050-ish, that's used by certain astrologers and for certain calculations, and it's just like porphyry. You figure out the house cusps just like you would porphyry. Where's the MC? Where's the ascendant? Just divide that equally. Done. Very little math. But that doesn't mark the beginning. That marks the middle. And so you project equally out, and that becomes the midpoint of the house. So it's very different. We also have, there's a modern Indian astrologer that I just adopted, Placidus. There's another modern modification of Indian astrology called the systems approach, where he uses whole sign, what we would call whole sign houses, but it forms the midpoint. So if you had 15 degrees of Pisces, that would form the middle of the house. Actually, 15 is bad because that actually creates a whole house. So if you had like 20 degrees, you would go back 15 and go forward 15, and that would be the house, and that 20 degrees would be the middle, and that would be a sensitive point. In every house of the horoscope, that middle point, called the most effective point. These are kind of, and I mean no disrespect when I say this, they're just sort of gadfly approaches insofar as they're minority, you know, I mean, the weird thing about astrology is you find great astrologers doing practically every school of astrology. So there's great KP astrologers, there's great systems approach astrologers, but if they're like a minority count in terms of the total number of people that are using whole sign, what we call whole sign houses. Yeah, and that's just the same thing. And Ernst Wellham, we're not going to talk about it, even though he's an interesting astrologer. Now, very last thing, I know I'm going over a minute. Do you need to be worried about polar regions? One of the criticisms of a lot of these house systems is that when you go high up in northern latitude, they fail. Now down here you don't have to worry about it, you never encounter it if you're just dealing with locals born, but if you're dealing with people up in certain times of the year, it creates very distorted, you know, if you set your software to show the actual house sizes, you'll get teeny little houses, you've got big fat houses. And this chart is calculated for a place called Barrow, Alaska. It's the furthest north town that actually has people in it in the United States. Alaska is a separate state that's way north to the left of Canada. I think to make this a little simpler, I'll show you. This is dawn. No. Yes, so this is shortly after dawn. This is, I actually don't know. I think I'm using equal houses here. This is equal houses, and the sun is above the horizon. It's 2 degrees Scorpio, and it's risen. Yay, new day in Barrow, Alaska. Now, when we move to midday, now this is whole sign houses. This is how the chart would look with whole sign houses. The ascendant is still there. The sun is still above the horizon. But now when I go to 5 p.m., wait a minute. Forward or backwards? Oh yeah. I go to 5 p.m. and the sun is like barely moved. And the sun and the moon, while it's gone forward a couple of degrees, is actually rotated backwards. The known laws of the way circles move gets violated when you go too far north. And in programs like Solar Fire, when you're like, well, let me see what Alcavicius would say, it just doesn't even let you do it. It just says, sorry, can't be computed, we're going to give you equal houses. Because there's always an ascendant, even if it doesn't move, there's always an ascendant.
But it may be retrograde.
Yes, and this is 2 a.m. So what happens is, I really should make this an animation. Things move backwards instead of forwards in Barrow, Alaska. So as the day goes on, it's not that the sun whips around here real fast, it actually kind of goes backwards. It's very weird. And yet it happens. God doesn't want us born in the far north.
He wants us born. God doesn't want us to be born so far north.
But if you use whole sign houses, you know, you're in business, doesn't matter.
But it could explain the eccentricity of people living in it.
So that's it. We're out of time. You have any questions? Hopefully,
I just have
yes.
one question. Okay, what would happen if a pregnant lady in an aeroplane crossing the North Pole gave birth on the aeroplane? How would you?
On the aeroplane.
Yeah.
Yes.
I
would say that one child would be born of pure free will. I would calculate for that place as best I could.
Yeah.
Now I use whole sign houses, so I'll always be able to figure out an ascendant. But we need to know the altitude of the plane if that made a difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to take that their first break and then check that as the way they work.
Horror.
I think I must have 100 of this guy.
No, I mean, for something like that, in India, when someone sees the astrologer, they don't know their birth time.
Chart done.
It's horror.
Chart done.
I just went to bed. Came back, I haven't had my my chart, don't you?
Yes.
I got way to do it on
the slides.
Oh, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
But she's saying.
Yes, they all have 12 houses.
Because there are two instances of April.
Yes, which I purposely left out of the slide.
Good move. There are two instances of an eightfold system, which nobody ever used.
Yeah. Yeah, there's evidence that at the very, very, very beginning, there were only 8 houses instead of 12. But don't worry about it, because quickly, whether by insight or divine revelation, I was like, no, you gotta do 12. So we got 12.
Same principle.
Now someone was asking me some weird question, maybe she's not here, about, oh, was it you? So maybe afterwards, your time
It was an
question.
equal houses.
Is actually the house.
By the way, if you have to go, I know it's overtime, so you've satisfied the South African, I'm gonna be polite, not leave till it's over. You can go if you need to, but I'll answer questions, because I don't think anyone's rushing in here. But we have another talk, right?
It's here, yeah.
Room on it, yes, room on it. Okay, so thank you all very much. Tomorrow, if you want to know about sidereal versus tropical zodiac, can there be more than one? Who wins the fight? It's all happening somewhere, I'm not sure what room, but tomorrow